I'm going to host the show, and Bud is off today from an earlier event. And my guest is going to be Hap Ziegler, and Hap and I are going to undertake to discuss in the limited time we have available an obscure subject called trade partnerships. But before I get on to that subject, I want to give you an update or two for some previous shows. One that Hap and I did a while back on the criminal justice complex, as I think I called it, about jails and jail constructions and the orders to the governor of California to reduce the jail population, prison population. That is coming to a head again. Governor Brown ignored the orders of the court, which gave him 3 months to come up with a plan. Apparently didn't submit any plan, and so they're going to go back, and the justices are going to order the reduction, as we discussed on the show, to a degree, some of the issues there. But what bothered me about this, and I felt the need to comment on it, was that Jerry Brown was quoted as saying, "We've talked to a lot of prison lawyers, and I understand that their job is to get people out of prison regardless of what the law may say." Well, as a lawyer, a former lawyer, I'm offended by that, and all I can say is that I guess I've talked to a lot of elected politicians, and Jerry Brown is ignoring decisions of 3 courts in the Supreme Court, and I suppose the only thing you can say about him is that his job is to get reelected no matter what the law and facts allow. So that's my commentary to the governor. And then we did a program a week or so ago on the mental health problems at the Santa Barbara County Jail. Nick Beeson and Families Act had a report that they've submitted to the Board of Supervisors and trying to get some action about reducing the number of mentally ill people that are being incarcerated with no care. And I just want to bring up to date on that. Nick is still working on this with Families Act. He's met with the Board of Supervisors individually, most of them, and they're trying to get some action there. And he says if anybody is interested, and we do have a few people contact us after the last show with their interest, they can contact him, Nick Beeson, at 805-455-3218, because they do want community activism and people out there helping. So today's show, NAFTA to TAFTA, Global Corporate Coups, is what I titled it, and it is intended to encompass the idea that business interests are using deals outside of the legislation within the internal governments of nations to overcome resistance to their power. So I think we should start with TAP with this idea that we call trade deals, or he's in North American Free Trade Association, or the current one that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the European version, all these titles. What are these trade deals really about? Are they treaties? What are they?
Well, these trade agreements is what they are, have to do with the unrestricted movement and sale of goods and services, or at least typically that's what it started out to be. And they were typically between 2 countries. What's happened is they become multilateral arrangements where several companies have joined together. And typically, although goods and services have passed back and forth, the movement of capital and labor has not been included, which is, we'll talk a little bit. And intellectual property. Right. Well, some have had intellectual property. Mm-hmm. For instance, in Europe, we do have intellectual property, reciprocity. We'll talk more about that, I guess, as we go on. Yep. Supporters of free trade say that that's what really helps countries focus on what they do best and gives them that competitive edge and allows them to purchase products where they don't or can't produce and bring it into their country. The detractors, of course, say that free trade leads to widespread abuses. And what happens is that it's used for union breaking, it's used for pushing people back economically because of the leverage to go to a different country if they're asking for too much money. And others feel that this concentration of capital that occurs in this situation is probably the worst result that'll happen.
Yeah, we'll get into some of those things because I think most of us who are skeptical about the purposes of free trade agreements remember the debate back in, 20 years ago when Ross Perot was on the stage and talking about NAFTA, and said you'd hear a great big sucking sound as jobs exited and companies, factories exited the United States. Well, I don't know if there was a sound or not, but it's true. I mean, estimates are minimally that we lost over 1 million jobs just on NAFTA alone, and maybe as many 5 million jobs over the next period of time with the other fair trade agreements. And the way that works, and I think the public should understand this, what happens is companies are given tax incentives to take jobs out of the country and put them into countries where the labor force is much cheaper and labor requirements are much less. Thus owners can 10, 12-hour days.
Well, you said tax incentives, did you?
Tax incentives as well. They can treat that as a tax cost,
right,
to write off. So there's all kinds of incentives, basically to encourage the taking. You know, if you can't undercut labor in domestically, what you do is you find labor offshore that's cheaper, and if you don't have to pay tariffs or other fees to bring that product back into the country, then the corporation has come out ahead.
And we see that over the last decade or 2 decades with China.
China is
and Bangladesh, and Southeast Asia for producing our clothing.
And it continues. I mean, not to get too far off the subject, but the corporations always have the ability, as you have alluded to earlier in the conversation, of moving these factories from spot to spot, continuing to play one labor market off against another labor market.
Correct.
Much as they used to do in the United States by taking it out of a union state like California or Michigan and moving it into Alabama or someplace, a free labor state, where they called it, right to work state. And now they do it internationally. But there's more to it than that. I think we maybe should go back and talk about the number of these agreements that have happened. NAFTA being the more infamous one. TAFTA, which was Central American Free Trade Agreement, which involved Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and later the Dominican Republic. And then the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being discussed right now,
right.
Which would involve Australia, Brunei, Chile, Canada, maybe Japan. They're sort of in negotiations. Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, U.S., and Vietnam. And then the TAFTA, the title of our show, NAFTA to TAFTA, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, also known as a Transatlantic Free Trade Area, which would be between the North American continent and the European economy. So that would involve all the European countries. Some of the things that these things include, though, are beyond this, the idea of free movement of products.
True.
And I think the public needs to be aware of some of the threats posed to domestic policies and to this general issue. One of the reasons, going back to it, one of the reasons that corporations, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many who criticize these trade agreements, are participant in them, is because they allow them not just to get cheaper labor, but to avoid environmental regulations.
That's correct.
And
labor regulations.
Labor regulations about hours or the age of the workers or all that. But you'd say, well, and say, okay, well, how can that be? We can just not bring that product into the country if that country is exploiting its environment, if it's polluting its rivers, or if it's polluting its air.
Or as we did with apartheid in South America decades ago.
But in fact, what happens is that the corporations in these agreements have been given the status, essentially the equal status of the nation. They have these tribunals, arbitration courts that are created, and these courts are, in these courts, which are not courts like you and I know in our legal practice, they're arbitration courts, which number one are pretty casual and pretty sloppy, but number two, they're privately run. The justices of these courts are, well, as I had it, well, let's get back to what the courts do. The tribunals do. What the tribunals do, if some business, let's say there's a business in Delaware that doesn't like a policy of Canada, and I'll give you an example of that. In Ontario, no, it was Ontario, anyway, Canadian province created a law that says that this company can't engage in fracking under the St. Lawrence Seaway.
Right.
So you say, well, okay, that's the government, the people of Canada say they don't want fracking in their country, but since Canada and the United States are part of the North American Free Trade Association, and this company in Delaware, who owns the company that wants to frack, now has the standing equal to Canada. And they brought a lawsuit against this company, against the state of, against Ontario, the province of Ontario.
The province, right.
And now this company is going to get millions of dollars because the province of Ontario, by passing a law against fracking, interfered with the profit expectation of the company in this Delaware company. So,
well, I think you hit on something that's important that I think most people don't understand. First of all, you mentioned the judges. The judges are appointed by the commerce members of the nations.
right.
So they're basically typically lawyers who have represented these multinational companies,
That's right.
and now they're picked to judge. I would say this is like
Well,
the
yeah.
fox defining the security for the hen house.
Well, the lawyers rotate either on the bench or before the bench.
Correct.
Right. And they're all representing, they're all corporate, prior corporate lawyers specializing in this business. And there's no public presence there, as I understand it.
That's my understanding too. And of course,
And
what we haven't mentioned, and we might want to mention, is that all these negotiations have been top secret.
Right.
People have actually been fired from their job because they've mentioned things about what's
You're
going on.
talking about the negotiations to create the new pacts.
Right, to create the pacts, which are not completed yet. They're not.
Right, that's the newest one.
Yes. And so what's interesting is that for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think is the one that's most recently gone to Congress, that just went to Congress after over 15 years of negotiation under the old form that was changed over to be the TPP. Another thing I wanted to mention that you brought up is that all these companies have to do, in your case of Canada and fracking is perfect, is say, well, we have geologists that say we could have gotten so many million metric tons of gas out of the ground, you're not allowing us to, and so you, Canada,
Right.
and all your citizens must pay us that money,
Exactly.
which of course is not all the money because they only have to pay them the profit. But what a great way to make money.
Oh yeah, you just bring a lawsuit saying I had an expectation of making money off of by polluting your environment or destroying your air or whatever it might be. You as the citizens of that community, Democratic, decide they don't want this kind of business in their environment. Then you have to pay me to not have to do it. And I was going to get back to that. So far, what they call these are called investor states.
Investor states, right?
Yeah, these are they're equal to nations, and they're basically companies. They're corporate powers. That's why I call this a coup. These are coups. Corporations have now become equal to government, and they have an equal footing to sue governments in a form that they get to control. That they have decided the foreign process. They aren't ruled by precedent. There's no report of the decisions. Nobody's going to, and there's no appeal.
And they select the judges.
And they select the judges who get to be on both sides of that, making lots of money on both sides probably. Or maybe they take a small salary when they're a judge, so they can get a large salary when they're on the other side. But anyway, so far, over $3.5 billion has been awarded to these investor state lawsuits. And on a substantial number of cases, when the investor state sues, even if they lose, they get paid their fees. They awarded their fees, the attorney fees. So that's millions of dollars.
Well,
So
I just
we
wanted
need to
point
know
out-
about that.
I just wanted to point out, those are the ones that are, those are the agreements that are already in effect.
Right. When this
And
new
of
one
course,
comes.
the TPP, we're referring to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if that one comes into effect, what can we expect? Well, we can look ahead at the cases that Glen's talking about. And Glen, you probably know this number too. 3.5 has been awarded. There's 14.7 billion still under
litigation. And almost certainly will be awarded all or at least all of that. So yeah, and what's frustrating to us who are concerned with to me is that your democratic process of deciding that, let's say, buses should have filters to take the soot out of the diesel smoke. That may be considered a violation of free trade between Canada and Mexico because Mexico doesn't have that law and it didn't exist before, and therefore the company that had the buses and the trucks that polluted the air had an expectation they wouldn't have to spend this money, so they can sue you and make you pay for them. Or you cannot establish a prohibition in California or the United States that says a company that produces running shoes in a factory that employs 8-year-olds can't sell that product in that country because that's what they do in that country and it's not our business to interfere. So it's 1,001 ways that this is corrupting the labor market and the environment, and there's very little we can do, and we're giving this up. And we went back in the beginning, we introduced how these things come to be. They're negotiated often, always secretly, often for a long period of time. The participants in the negotiation project and the latest one, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, over 600 corporations have representatives involved in this negotiation. There is almost nobody from the Congress, and there is no open public press to negotiate with.
Well, there was no press, at least for the first 14 or 15 years.
That's right.
There was no Congress.
Right.
So
only recently has Congress been allowed to have some peek of it. The president has proposed that this go on what they call a fast track process, which means that when it comes up to vote, even if Congress does get a chance to look at, your elected representatives get a chance to look at this legislation and decide they don't like parts of it, they won't be able to amend it, they won't be able to modify it, and they won't be able to vote for part of it or not. They'll have to put it up or down, all or nothing on a vote. So once again, this is going to be rammed down your throat. There are those who say that this is unconstitutional, and I think it should be challenged because it does smack to me as being a treaty. It's a treaty, it's a negotiation between nations, and treaties under the U.S. Constitution require a 2/3 vote of the Senate. So they should be done by treaty, I think, but they've been done historically for the last 20 years or so by this type of fast-track legislation in which the rights of the citizens of this nation and the citizens of other nations are being compromised to the profit benefit of corporations. And that's, one of the things we need to think about is what corporations are doing to this country.
It's interesting. I find it interesting that people are up in arms, and of course the NRA and a whole group are reinterpreting the Constitution and the Second Amendment, or at least let's say interpreting it the way they would like it. Whether I'm for or against it doesn't matter.
Right.
But it's interesting. This is dealing with Section 1, Article 8, which you and I mentioned, and that's where Congress is supposed to regulate commerce with foreign nations.
That's right.
And this is completely eliminating that section.
And
the sad thing is most of us, including us, because we haven't been able to read a copy of it, don't even know what's going on. But yet 600 corporations and their agents and representatives know all the terms, know what's been negotiated away and what's been included, et cetera.
Oh, they fine-tuned it immensely. I mean, I mentioned copyright and intellectual property, and one of the things that leaked out, I think it was Snowden, some of the Snowden leaks got some of this out, was that they're going to extend the copyright protection periods from 28 years to 56 years or something like that. So things were already off of, not copyright, but trademark, patent. So things were already unpatented, were available like generic medicines, and other inventions are going to go back into being quote-unquote protected property, and corporations will start making huge amounts of money off of something that was already outside of it, thereby raising the cost of medicine and raising the cost of all kinds of services that the public has a right to have after a few years. But it's more than that. So I mean, I have talked and been concerned ever since, I suppose, Citizens United sort of brought it to the head for most of us, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that for purposes of free speech, corporations were people too. And we now have this further and further activity by corporations to surpass and replace voters and human beings as creators of policy in countries around the world, and to put themselves in exalted positions where even if the citizens of a country say, I no longer want this product being imported into my country, you can't stop it because you have this treaty.
here are some examples along with your Canadian one. Philip Morris is using these investor state type applications against Australia because Australia wants them to label cigarettes hazardous.
That's right.
Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical, is attacking Canada because of their drug patent policy, probably for the length of time, because as we all have heard, you can get your drugs in Canada for less than the United States. Part of that has to do with their patent application. Right. European firms are attacking the poor, crippled Egyptian post-revolution government for their minimum wage increase, saying that that's not in accordance with the standards. And then the last one is South Africa's post-apartheid affirmative action is being attacked too.
Because it's in restraint of what, hiring or
something? Well, it's in restraint of what they were agreeing to when they first had.
Right.
I mean, these aren't part of the Trans-Pacific, but these are examples of how things can be attacked with these extrajudicial situations.
Yeah, I mean, it just removes the ability of the people. It strikes down a basic concept of democracy, which is the majority can change policy over time. Now, theoretically, this legislation, because it is being adopted by Congress in this possibly unconstitutional manner, can be modified by Congress in the future, I suppose, but I can't imagine corporations letting that happen. They will, if they modify it anyway, it'll probably be modified to make it more profitable for the businesses. So anyway, I want to go back to this idea in the last few minutes we have, if we can, to the idea of how is it that corporations have gotten into the position that they have in which they can actually be considered viable independent agencies, not subject to the will of, you and I, if we committed a crime or engaged in an activity, let's say we had a factory, a thing in our backyard, we're producing something that was awful and evil and smelled bad, and our neighbors complained. Somebody could pass a law.
Would this be like your wine?
Yeah, it'd be like our wine. And so the neighbors could complain and say, well, I don't want that person doing, they can't be tanning hides in the middle of a city anymore. If we were a corporation, we could say, oh, no, we've got a right to do that because we have an expectation of property. But if it's you and I, we're subject to the will of that group. Anyway, so it bothers me that they've gotten this power when they weren't. Corporations are creatures of the state. This is what we seem to have forgotten, that corporations, the first corporations, were almost always limited in terms. I mean,
7 years.
Or less. They were
often, up to 7 years.
Yeah, they were created to accomplish a certain purpose. Build a canal.
That's correct.
Or a trade with the Indies, or do something, and then they went out of business. They didn't have perpetual life. Correct. You and I don't have perpetual life, and you and I know that from law school that there are things that we, there are rules that say we cannot create something that has perpetual life. It has to vest into somebody else before it can. But corporations do have this incredible, super, almost like a bad Hollywood movie.
Well, you see that just in our own state, where Prop 13 is always a hot topic.
Absolutely.
And so what happens is that if you or I pass away, or even if we just sell our property, let's use that's a better example, we sell our property, the new owner has a basis that's adjusted up to the sales price.
And the taxes go up.
But if I'm a corporation, I just sell my shares to you, the property valuation stays exactly the same.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and we know that El Segundo, the Chevron factory in El Segundo now for 70 years, they've actually changed it among various corporations, but it never actually got to a sale of the property, so it never got reassessed or revalued.
Right.
But yeah, so
that's an example of corporations.
One of the permutations of corporations being sort of a Frankenstein's monster, bigger than people, bigger than society, and they're taking over society, in my opinion. They're exerting power and influence and receiving protection that the rest of us could never expect to have. And now we have them in these international coups where they are actually getting together behind the scenes in secret meetings where they attend and drafting laws that are going to bind the rest of us for decades, maybe forever. So,
or at least until the corporations want to change it.
Well, until they want to change it, so the public needs to get this sense of outrage back about businesses running their lives And not means, it's like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Remember the little guys out there with the brooms, and he's using the broom and the bucket to make his life easier, and pretty soon they're out of control. They're running everything. And that's what corporations seem to me to be doing. We need to be in charge again. And the way to get in charge again is, number one, probably create a constitutional amendment in the United States that said corporations are not people, despite what Mitt Romney had to say, my friend. And also to pay attention to things like, obscure things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's
true, because I think corporations as individuals really is a parallel issue to these agreements we've been talking about. In other words, they don't have to be defined as people to have these agreements go through.
Well, individual business people, or an individual rich person, I think is more easily reached in terms of control and being held accountable. And look what happened on Wall Street. All of these Wall Street bankers and financiers and all these companies under our Attorney General have escaped any criminal responsibility individually and the rationale or the excuse that our Attorney General uses, our federal Attorney General uses, is that it's so hard to actually to hold any one individual responsible for the behavior of the whole aggregate business.
Well, we're seeing that with Chris Christie, aren't we?
Yeah, well, but anyway.
Different situation.
But if this was just, let's say Donald Trump, and he didn't have a corporation, I don't know, or some, the old days, there was one person, J. Pierpont Morgan or somebody, you could go after that individual and pretty much hone in on the resources and power and behavior of that individual. Corporations are much harder to hold on to. So I think, number one, we need to get corporations are people, a constitutional amendment. Number two, we need to pay attention to things like what this is doing to us. Object. I understand that the whole Democratic, and I give credit to the Democratic Party for this, all the House representatives of the Democratic Party are objected to the fast track, at last I heard, and maybe it will actually have to come to a vote.
All, yes.
And so that's good. And then on top of that, we need to back off from this idea that corporations should be given these private statuses. Lots of this Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European TAFTA, the European one that's proposed, are really harmful to the economic health of individuals and also probably to their physical health. They raise the price of drugs, of medicines. They even want to have patent protection for procedures, for medical procedures, I understand. So this is going to hit us all, both in our health and in our pocketbook.
Actually, they do have patents on processes, they call them.
Yeah, well, they want to extend those processes.
Well, before this is over, I'd like to suggest that we come back and do one on corporations.
We probably should give that its own day in court. So anyway, Hap, yeah, we'll do that. Ali Adamczyk, our director, I thank you. Juanita Chatham, our director, I thank you. Liz Burke, thank you. It's been a lot of fun. It certainly went faster than I thought it would. And we'll do this again and maybe just focus on corporations and what they really are. Are they animal or paper?
Okay, sounds good.